Reality Case Studies, Season 1, Amanda Batula and Kyle Cooke from Summer House. Episode 3, Can Someone Change If They Don't Understand Why They Do What They Do? Shame, Alcohol, Identity, and the Long Road to Lasting Change. Welcome back to the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. I'm Stephanie Buckley, an AMFT, ADHD, and OCD specialist, family systems coach, and creator of Reality Case Studies. If you've been following this series, thank you for joining me again. If this is your first episode, I'm especially glad you're here because this series is unlike anything else you'll find in the podcast space. If you're just joining us, welcome. Although each episode in this series stands on its own, I've been building a psychological foundation using the publicly available relationship of Amanda Batula and Kyle Cooke from Summer House to better understand ourselves, our relationships, and the emotional systems that shape human behavior. In episode 1, Who Was Amanda Before Kyle? Identity, differentiation, and becoming someone else's dream, we explored Amanda's life before the relationship and introduced the psychological concept of differentiation of self, one of the cornerstones of Bowen family systems theory. We discussed how healthy relationships require us to remain emotionally connected without losing our individual identity, values, and sense of self. We also examined identity development, attachment, and why understanding who we are before entering a relationship often influences the relationship we eventually create. In episode 2, part A, Why Didn't She Just Leave? Attachment, emotional safety, and the psychology of staying, we shifted our attention to one of the questions people ask most often while watching relationships unfold. Rather than judging why someone stays, we explored how attachment styles, emotional safety, nervous system regulation, chronic hypervigilance, emotional labor, and family of origin experiences can all influence a person's ability to leave a relationship. We also discussed why leaving is rarely a single decision, but often the result of years of emotional experiences accumulating over time. In episode 2, part B, When Love Isn't Enough, Shame, Boundaries, and Why Relationship Patterns. Keep repeating, we examined why sincere apologies and genuine love are not always enough to create lasting behavioral change. Together, we explored the psychology of shame, emotional regulation, healthy boundaries, overfunctioning and underfunctioning, homeostasis within family systems, and why repeated relationship patterns often continue until both individuals begin developing greater self-awareness, accountability, and emotional regulation. We concluded by discussing the important distinction between remorse and lasting behavioral change, recognizing that insight is essential, but must be followed by repeated practice before meaningful change can occur. Today, we're going to build on that foundation by turning our attention toward another question that clients ask me every week in my therapy practice, and one that many viewers have asked while watching Kyle's journey unfold over the years. Can someone truly change if they don't understand why they do what they do? Together, we'll explore the psychology of shame, alcohol, identity, entrepreneurship, chronic stress, emotional regulation, and the long road to lasting behavioral change. Rather than reviewing reality television for entertainment, Reality Case Studies uses publicly available relationships and life experiences as educational case studies to teach evidence-informed psychology. Throughout this series, we'll explore attachment theory, Bowen family systems theory, neuroscience, emotional regulation, communication, executive functioning, and relationship dynamics. My goal is not to help you become an expert on reality television. My goal is to help you become an expert on understanding yourself, the people you love, and the emotional patterns that shape your life. Every week in my therapy office, I sit with individuals, couples, parents, teenagers, athletes, and young adults who are struggling with many of the same questions people ask while watching reality television. Why do I keep choosing the same kind of relationship? Why can't my partner hear how hurt I am? Why does my adult child continue making choices that seem so self-destructive? Why does someone promise they'll change and yet continue repeating the same behavior? These are deeply human questions, and psychology offers us a framework for exploring them with curiosity instead of criticism. Before we begin today's discussion, I'd like to make something very clear, because I believe it's an important ethical responsibility. Although I am a clinician, I am not diagnosing Amanda Batula, Kyle Cooke, or anyone else we discuss throughout this series. Making a diagnosis requires a comprehensive clinical assessment, informed consent, detailed personal history, and an ongoing therapeutic relationship. None of those things are possible through watching a television program or following someone on social media. Reality television also presents edited footage that is designed to tell a compelling story rather than provide a complete psychological picture. As viewers, we see only selected moments from people's lives, not the entirety of their experiences. Instead, these reality case studies use publicly available interactions to illustrate psychological concepts that many of us encounter in our own lives. Think of them as teaching examples. Just as a professor might use a historical event to explain leadership, or a business school might use a well-known company to explain organizational behavior, we're using familiar public relationships to better understand the psychology of human behavior. Throughout today's episode, I'll introduce psychological concepts, explain what they mean in everyday language, describe what researchers have learned about them, and then use examples from both my therapy practice and these publicly available interactions to help make those concepts easier to understand. My hope is that you'll leave today's episode not thinking more about Amanda or Kyle, but thinking more deeply about your own relationships and your own emotional patterns. Over the past 3 episodes, we've spent much of our time understanding Amanda's experience. We explored attachment theory, emotional safety, why people remain in relationships that cause them pain, the role of the nervous system, Bowen family systems theory, boundaries, shame, and the emotional patterns that often develop over many years within long-term relationships. Today, I'd like to gently shift our perspective. Healthy relationships are never created by one person alone. They are emotional systems made up of 2 individuals whose histories, nervous systems, coping strategies, and attachment experiences continuously influence one another. If we only understand one person's emotional world, we're seeing only part of the picture. Using Kyle's publicly available experiences as our educational case study, I'd like us to explore a broader psychological question that extends far beyond reality television. Why do intelligent, capable, successful people continue engaging in behaviors that damage the very relationships they say matter most to them? That question is not unique to Kyle. It's a question that applies to alcohol, workaholism, perfectionism, compulsive behaviors, emotional avoidance, gaming, overspending, and many other patterns I see every week in my clinical practice. As we work through today's episode, I invite you to become curious rather than judgmental. Curiosity creates learning. Judgment usually ends the conversation before understanding has a chance to begin. One of the first concepts I teach nearly every client who walks into my therapy office is something that sounds deceptively simple. Behavior is communication. At first, most people assume communication means talking, listening, texting, arguing, explaining, or trying to make another person understand. While all of those are certainly forms of communication, psychology teaches us that human beings communicate in many different ways, often without realizing it. We communicate through our facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, habits, patterns, choices, and even through what we consistently avoid doing. In fact, many of the most important messages people send are communicated without saying a single word. Think about a teenager who comes home from school, walks straight to their bedroom, closes the door and says, "I'm fine." Their words tell one story, but their behavior may be communicating something entirely different. Perhaps they are overwhelmed, embarrassed, anxious, lonely, or exhausted. Their nervous system is communicating through withdrawal long before they have the language to explain what is happening internally. The same process happens throughout adulthood. Some people communicate stress by becoming irritable. Some communicate it by working longer hours. Others begin drinking more frequently, isolating, becoming perfectionistic, scrolling endlessly, shopping, exercising compulsively, or staying so busy they never have to sit still with what they feel. Although these behaviors look different on the surface, psychology encourages us to ask the same question each time. What is this behavior trying to communicate? That question matters because it moves us away from immediate judgment and toward clinical curiosity. Notice that I did not ask whether the behavior is healthy or unhealthy. I asked what it may be communicating. That distinction is important because if we only focus on stopping the behavior, we often miss the emotional need that created the behavior in the first place. As therapists, we are trained to become curious before becoming corrective. Curiosity helps us understand the function of behavior, while correction without understanding often creates resistance, shame, or defensiveness. When psychologists talk about the function of a behavior, we are referring to the purpose that behavior serves for the individual. Every repeated behavior accomplishes something, even if that behavior is ultimately harmful. It may reduce anxiety, create temporary relief, help someone avoid painful emotions, or distract them from shame, grief, loneliness, fear, insecurity, or overwhelming stress. Understanding the function of a behavior does not mean we approve of it, minimize it, or ignore its consequences. It means we are trying to understand why the nervous system continues choosing it. Imagine someone goes to a physician because they develop severe migraines every Friday afternoon. A good physician would not simply say, "Well, stop getting headaches." They would begin investigating. When did the headaches start? How often do they occur? What else changed? Could sleep deprivation, hormones, dehydration, blood pressure, stress, or another medical issue be involved? The headache itself is not the full diagnosis. It is information. Psychology approaches behavior in much the same way. Repeated drinking, defensiveness, avoidance, overworking, emotional shutdown, or compulsive distraction are behaviors. The deeper question is, what emotional problem has this behavior been helping solve? That question shifts the entire conversation. Imagine someone who works 12-hour days, answers emails late into the night, and rarely takes time off. From the outside, we might describe them as ambitious or hardworking. But what if work has become the only place where they feel competent? What if productivity temporarily quiets feelings of inadequacy? What if staying busy prevents them from sitting with grief, loneliness, fear, or anxiety? In that case, the work itself may not be the entire problem. The work may have become the solution to an emotional state the person does not yet know how to tolerate. The same principle applies to many repetitive behaviors. Alcohol may temporarily quiet anxiety. Perfectionism may temporarily reduce uncertainty. Gaming may temporarily create a sense of achievement. Shopping may temporarily relieve sadness. Scrolling social media may temporarily distract from loneliness. None of those behaviors solve the underlying emotional difficulty, but each may provide temporary relief. The nervous system pays very close attention to relief because one of the brain's primary responsibilities is survival. Whenever something decreases emotional discomfort, even briefly, the brain notices and quietly records, "Remember this. The next time we feel overwhelmed, this helped." This process is closely connected to a behavioral psychology concept called negative reinforcement. Despite the way the phrase sounds, negative reinforcement does not mean punishment. In psychology, negative reinforcement means that a behavior becomes more likely to happen again because it removes or reduces something unpleasant. For example, if someone feels anxious after a long day and pours a drink, the alcohol may temporarily reduce racing thoughts, muscle tension, or emotional discomfort. The next time that person feels similarly overwhelmed, the brain remembers that alcohol provided relief. The behavior becomes reinforced not because the person lacks intelligence or love for their family, but because the nervous system learned that the behavior reduced distress. This is one reason repeated behaviors become so difficult to change. They often begin as attempts to solve emotional problems, not create them. Over time, however, the temporary solution can become its own problem. A behavior that once provided relief may begin damaging trust, intimacy, health, work, parenting, or self-respect. That is when many people feel trapped. The behavior helps them escape discomfort in the short term, but it creates pain in the long term. This is why simply telling someone to stop is rarely enough. If we remove the behavior without understanding the emotional need underneath it, the nervous system will often search for another strategy to meet the same need. Again, I want to pause here and remind everyone that I am not suggesting I know what was happening inside Kyle Cooke. I have not evaluated him, and I am not diagnosing him. None of us can know another person's private internal experience from television alone. What we can say is that many viewers observed public situations involving alcohol, conflict, apologies, and repeated attempts to change. Rather than making assumptions about Kyle personally, we can use those publicly available moments as a teaching opportunity to ask a broader psychological question. If alcohol, avoidance, defensiveness, or any repetitive behavior is serving a psychological purpose, what purpose might that be? That question moves us away from blame and toward understanding. Every week in my therapy practice, I meet individuals who are frustrated because they have spent years trying to eliminate a behavior without ever understanding why it developed in the first place. Some have tried quitting alcohol. Others have tried stopping compulsive spending, emotional eating, overworking, gaming, perfectionism, or repeated relationship patterns. Many are discouraged because the behavior keeps returning. What we eventually discover together is that the behavior was never the entire problem. It was the nervous system's attempt to solve another problem. Once we identify that deeper emotional need, we can begin teaching the brain healthier ways of meeting it. That is where lasting change begins. Not with shame, not with criticism, not with humiliation, but with curiosity, awareness, accountability, and understanding. Behavior is communication, and when we learn how to listen to what behavior is trying to tell us, we begin moving closer to the root of meaningful change. If behavior is communication, and if repeated behaviors often attempt to solve emotional problems, then the next question becomes incredibly important. Why does alcohol become such a powerful source of relief for so many people? To answer that, we need to understand something every human brain is constantly searching for: relief. And that brings us to our next chapter. Alcohol is rarely the beginning of the story. If behavior is communication, then alcohol is rarely just about alcohol. That does not mean alcohol is harmless, and it certainly does not mean repeated drinking should be minimized when it damages trust, safety, health, parenting, work, or relationships. What it means is that when alcohol becomes part of a repeated emotional pattern, psychology asks us to look beyond the drink itself and become curious about what the nervous system may be seeking. In many cases, alcohol does not begin as the problem. It begins as a solution to something the person does not yet know how to regulate in a healthier way. Alcohol can temporarily change the internal state of the body. It may quiet racing thoughts, reduce social anxiety, numb shame, soften emotional pain, create a sense of confidence, or help someone escape the pressure they feel inside. That temporary relief is precisely what makes it so reinforcing. The brain pays attention when discomfort decreases. If someone feels overwhelmed, inadequate, anxious, lonely, or emotionally flooded, and alcohol provides even a short period of relief, the nervous system records that information. It begins to associate drinking with escape, confidence, ease, connection, or emotional shutdown. The problem is that temporary relief often comes with long-term cost. From a neuroscience perspective, alcohol affects several areas of the brain, but one of the most important is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain responsible for judgment, impulse control, emotional regulation, decision-making, perspective-taking, and the ability to pause before reacting. When alcohol reduces the efficiency of the prefrontal cortex, people become less able to think ahead, consider consequences, regulate emotions, or accurately read the emotional impact of their behavior on others. This is why a conversation that might be difficult but manageable at noon can become explosive at midnight after drinking. The emotional brain is louder, and the thinking brain is less available. Tiny match, gasoline, unfortunate lighting design. This becomes especially important in relationships where trust has already been damaged. If a partner has repeatedly experienced pain connected to alcohol, late nights, or emotional unavailability, then alcohol stops being a neutral substance inside the relationship. It becomes emotionally loaded. It becomes connected to the history file we discussed earlier. One person may experience drinking as relaxation or fun, while the other experiences it as a warning signal. Neither nervous system is responding only to the present moment. Both are responding to what alcohol has come to represent inside that particular relationship system. In my therapy practice, I often see this distinction with clients who initially come in believing alcohol is the whole problem. Sometimes alcohol is absolutely a central problem and needs direct intervention, support, and accountability. But often, as we slow down and become curious, we discover that alcohol has been functioning as a coping strategy for anxiety, shame, grief, social insecurity, chronic stress, trauma, emotional avoidance, or a deep fear of not being enough. When we only say, stop drinking, we may be addressing the behavior without addressing the emotional pain underneath it. Lasting change usually requires both. The behavior needs accountability, and the nervous system needs new tools. Using Kyle's publicly available story as an educational case study, we can ask a broader question without diagnosing him or claiming to know his private experience. When viewers watched repeated conversations about drinking, late nights, apologies, and promises to do better, the question many people asked was, why doesn't he just stop? Psychology invites a deeper question. What might drinking have been helping him not feel? Was it stress, shame, pressure, fear of failure, the need to perform as the fun one, the exhaustion of entrepreneurship, the discomfort of emotional vulnerability? We cannot know the answer for Kyle, but those are the exact kinds of questions I ask in my office when any repetitive behavior continues despite negative consequences. This is also why alcohol and shame often become intertwined. Shame is the feeling of being fundamentally flawed, not simply having made a mistake. If someone drinks too much, hurts their partner, wakes up remorseful, and then feels flooded with shame, alcohol may later become the very tool they use to escape that shame. The cycle can become brutal. The behavior creates shame. Shame creates discomfort. Discomfort increases the urge to escape. Alcohol provides temporary escape. Then the behavior repeats and creates more shame. That is not a moral failure. It is a cycle. And cycles require interruption, not humiliation. The difficult truth is that alcohol can provide short-term relief while creating long-term emotional instability. It may help someone feel relaxed in the moment, but it can also reduce emotional regulation, increase impulsivity, damage trust, intensify conflict, and prevent the deeper work that the nervous system actually needs. If alcohol becomes the primary strategy for relief, the person may never develop the skills required to tolerate anxiety, sit with shame, communicate vulnerability, or repair conflict while sober and emotionally present. The nervous system keeps reaching for the quick exit ramp instead of learning how to drive through the tunnel. That is why meaningful change requires more than removing alcohol from the equation. Sobriety or reduced drinking may be necessary, but it is often only the beginning of the work. The deeper question becomes, what will this person do with the emotions alcohol used to numb? How will they handle stress? How will they sit with shame? How will they tolerate disappointment? How will they communicate fear without becoming defensive? How will they learn to be emotionally present when their nervous system wants to disappear? Those are the questions that begin moving a person from behavioral control toward actual emotional growth. So when we ask whether someone can change, we have to ask whether they understand the function of the behavior they are trying to change. If alcohol has been serving as relief, confidence, escape, identity, social glue, or emotional anesthesia, then removing alcohol without replacing it with healthier regulation skills leaves the nervous system without its familiar coping tool. That is when many people relapse into the same behavior or substitute a new one. The goal is not simply to take away the coping strategy. The goal is to help the person build a life and a nervous system that no longer need that strategy in the same way. And that brings us to the next layer of this case study, because alcohol does not exist in a vacuum. It often becomes more powerful when it is paired with chronic pressure, identity, public performance, financial responsibility, and the deep fear that everything you have built could fall apart. To understand why change can be so difficult, we also need to understand the psychological weight of entrepreneurship, achievement, and what happens when a person's self-worth becomes fused with success. To understand why change can be so difficult, we have to look at the emotional environment surrounding the behavior. Alcohol, defensiveness, avoidance, overworking, and emotional shutdown rarely exist in a vacuum. They usually live inside a larger system of stress, identity, pressure, expectations, and coping. This is especially important when we are talking about someone who is publicly building a company, managing investors, navigating a marriage, filming a reality television show, and trying to maintain a public identity all at the same time. Again, I am not diagnosing Kyle or claiming to know his private internal experience. I am using the publicly available story as a teaching tool because the psychological themes are ones I see often in my therapy practice, especially with high-achieving individuals who have tied their sense of worth to performance. Entrepreneurship can be deeply exciting, but it can also be psychologically consuming. Starting a business is not simply a job. It often becomes an extension of the person's identity. Every sale, every investor conversation, every product launch, every financial setback, every public review, and every business decision can begin to feel personal. When the business does well, the person feels validated. When the business struggles, the person may not simply think, the company is having a hard quarter. They may feel, I am failing. That distinction matters because when work becomes fused with identity, stress is no longer just about productivity. It becomes about self-worth. This is where we need to introduce the concept of identity fusion. Identity fusion occurs when a person's sense of self becomes so tightly connected to a role, relationship, career, achievement, or external outcome that it becomes difficult to separate who they are from what they do. For example, An athlete who has been praised their entire life for performance may not know who they are when they are injured or no longer competing. A parent who has spent decades caring for children may feel lost when the children leave home. A founder may begin experiencing the company not as something they built, but as proof of whether they are valuable, capable, impressive, or enough. When identity becomes fused with success, failure does not feel like information. It feels like a threat to the self. From a nervous system perspective, that kind of identity pressure can keep the body in a chronic stress state. Chronic stress is not just having a busy week or a demanding season. Chronic stress occurs when the nervous system remains activated for an extended period of time without enough recovery. The body may continue releasing stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, which are helpful in short bursts, but damaging when they remain elevated for too long. In the short term, stress hormones can sharpen attention and increase energy. Over time, however, chronic stress can disrupt sleep, reduce patience, increase irritability, impair memory, weaken emotional regulation, and make it much harder for the prefrontal cortex to do its job. The prefrontal cortex, as we have discussed throughout this series, is the part of the brain involved in planning, impulse control, judgment, empathy, emotional regulation, and the ability to pause before reacting. When someone is under chronic stress, the prefrontal cortex becomes less efficient. This means the very part of the brain a person needs in order to communicate thoughtfully, tolerate shame, regulate emotion, and make healthier decisions is often the part of the brain most compromised by prolonged pressure. That is why someone may understand intellectually that they need to change and still struggle to access the emotional regulation required to actually do it in the moment. In my therapy practice, I often see this with high-achieving clients. From the outside, they look successful. They may be entrepreneurs, athletes, executives, parents, performers, students, or professionals who appear highly capable. But internally, many are running on a nervous system that never fully rests. They may feel like they cannot slow down because slowing down allows fear to catch up with them. They may believe that if they stop producing, they will stop mattering. They may use work, alcohol, humor, busyness, or control as ways to avoid the deeper fear that they are not enough without the performance. That is why achievement can become both a strength and a trap. Achievement gives people structure, confidence, purpose, and external validation. It can build self-efficacy, which is the belief that my actions matter and I can influence the direction of my life. But when achievement becomes the only source of worth, the person becomes vulnerable. They may begin needing constant evidence that they are succeeding in order to feel okay inside. Success becomes emotional oxygen. Without it, shame rushes in. And when shame rushes in, the nervous system looks for relief. This is one reason alcohol can become especially reinforcing for people under chronic pressure. Alcohol may offer a temporary break from the internal demands of performance. It may create a sense of relaxation, confidence, or social ease. It may allow the person to step out of the role of founder, provider, performer, or problem solver and temporarily feel less burdened. The problem is that the relief is short-lived, while the consequences may last much longer. A night of escape may create a morning of shame. The morning of shame may increase the desire for another escape later. The cycle continues, and the underlying identity pressure remains untouched. When we look at Kyle's public story through this lens, the question becomes less about whether he was successful or whether he loved Amanda. The deeper psychological question is what happens when a person is carrying the emotional weight of being the founder, the fun one, the provider, the public personality, the husband, the cast member, and the person expected to keep the business moving forward. Again, we cannot know his private experience, but we can use this public case study to teach a very real psychological principle. When a person's identity becomes fused with performance, accountability can feel threatening because it touches the part of them that already fears failure. This is where many couples become stuck. One partner is asking for emotional accountability. The other partner's nervous system hears identity threat. One person says, "I need you to understand how much this hurt me." The other person hears, "You are failing again." The first partner wants repair. The second partner feels shame. Instead of moving toward accountability, the ashamed nervous system may move toward defensiveness, minimization, humor, anger, avoidance, or escape. The behavior becomes frustrating for the partner seeking repair because it appears the other person does not care. But psychologically, the person may care deeply and still lack the internal regulation to stay present when shame is activated. This does not remove responsibility. It actually increases it. Understanding the emotional roots of a behavior does not excuse the behavior. It tells us where the real work must begin. If chronic stress, identity fusion, shame, and alcohol are all part of the cycle, then change requires much more than saying, "I'll do better." It requires building a new relationship with stress. It requires separating worth from performance. It requires learning how to tolerate shame without escaping it. It requires developing sober emotional regulation skills. It requires accountability that is consistent enough for the nervous system and the relationship to trust. That is the long road to lasting change. It is not glamorous. It is not usually dramatic. It is not one apology, one promise, one vacation, or one emotional conversation. It is the daily practice of noticing the old pattern and choosing a different response before the nervous system grabs the familiar exit ramp. It is learning to say, "I am feeling overwhelmed and I want to escape, but I am going to stay present." It is learning to say, "I feel ashamed, but I am going to listen instead of defend." It is learning to say, "My work matters, but it is not the only proof that I matter." And that brings us directly into the next section, because shame rarely announces itself clearly. Most people do not walk into a room and say, "I am feeling ashamed and I am afraid I am not enough." Shame usually comes disguised as something else. It may look like defensiveness, anger, joking, minimizing, blaming, withdrawing, or acting as though nothing matters. To understand why people repeat behaviors that hurt the people they love, we need to understand what shame sounds like when it is trying not to be seen. The hidden emotion that keeps people stuck. One of the most misunderstood emotions in psychology is shame. In everyday conversation, people often use the words guilt and shame as though they mean the same thing. They don't. Understanding the difference between these two emotions may be one of the most important concepts we'll discuss today because they influence behavior in dramatically different ways. Guilt is generally considered an adaptive emotion. In psychology, an adaptive emotion is one that helps us function in healthy and productive ways. Guilt occurs when we recognize that something we have done has caused harm to another person. Guilt says, "I made a mistake." Because guilt focuses on behavior rather than identity, it often motivates repair. A person experiencing healthy guilt may apologize, accept responsibility, ask how they can make things right, and become motivated to behave differently in the future. Although guilt is uncomfortable, it often serves an important purpose because it helps strengthen relationships through accountability and repair. Shame, however, is fundamentally different. Shame does not simply tell us that we have done something wrong. Shame tells us that we are wrong. Instead of focusing on behavior, shame attacks identity. It whispers messages like, "You're a failure. You're disappointing. You're weak. You'll never change." If people really knew who you were, they wouldn't love you. Unlike guilt, which often encourages connection and repair, shame frequently encourages hiding, withdrawal, defensiveness, denial, or escape. That is because shame feels psychologically threatening. It convinces us that our worth as a person is at risk. Imagine a young child accidentally knocking over a glass of milk during dinner. If a parent calmly says, "Accidents happen, let's clean it up together," the child learns that mistakes can be repaired. They may feel a little guilty for being careless, but they also learn that making a mistake does not change who they are. Now imagine a different response. The parent angrily says, "You always ruin everything. You're so careless. Why can't you ever do anything right?" The spilled milk is no longer the central issue. The child's identity has become the focus. Over time, experiences like these can teach the nervous system that mistakes are dangerous because they threaten love, acceptance, or belonging. One of the researchers who has done tremendous work helping the public understand shame is Brené Brown. She describes shame as the intensely painful belief that we are somehow flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Whether someone has read her work or not, I think many people recognize that feeling. Most of us have experienced moments where we were less afraid of admitting a mistake than we were of what that mistake might say about who we are. The nervous system does not tolerate shame comfortably. Instead, it instinctively looks for ways to reduce that emotional pain. Sometimes people hide, sometimes they blame, sometimes they become sarcastic, sometimes they make jokes, sometimes they become angry. Others work harder, drink more, distract themselves, overachieve, or emotionally withdraw. Although these behaviors appear very different, they often serve the same psychological purpose. They help the person move away from the painful feeling of shame, at least temporarily. This is why shame rarely announces itself directly. Very few people say, "I'm feeling deeply ashamed right now." Instead, shame often disguises itself as something else. It may sound like, "You're overreacting." It may sound like, "It wasn't that bad." It may sound like, "Why do you always bring this up?" It may sound like, "Can we just move on?" Sometimes it sounds like silence. Sometimes it sounds like walking away from the conversation altogether. To the partner seeking accountability, these responses often feel dismissive or uncaring. To the person experiencing shame, however, the nervous system may believe it is simply trying to survive an emotionally threatening experience. In my therapy practice, I frequently observe this dynamic between couples. One partner begins talking about the impact a behavior has had on them. They may say, "When you drank that night, I felt frightened," or "When you didn't come home, I felt unimportant." Their goal is to communicate hurt and seek understanding. The other partner, however, may hear something very different. Instead of hearing, "I want you to understand my experience," they hear, "You're failing again." Their nervous system immediately shifts into protection mode. They begin explaining, minimizing, interrupting, or defending themselves. The conversation quickly moves away from the original hurt because both people are now responding to entirely different emotional experiences. One of the greatest misconceptions about defensiveness is that it means someone doesn't care. Sometimes that may be true. More often, however, defensiveness reflects a nervous system that has become overwhelmed by shame. That does not make defensiveness helpful, nor does it remove responsibility for hurtful behavior. What it does is help us understand why insight alone is often insufficient. A person may fully understand that they have caused pain, yet still lack the emotional regulation skills necessary to remain present while listening to the impact of their actions. Again, I want to be clear that I am not suggesting this is what Kyle was experiencing internally. None of us knows his private emotional world. However, many viewers observed public moments where conversations about alcohol, trust, or accountability appeared to become emotionally charged. Rather than assuming motives, we can use those interactions as an opportunity to ask a broader psychological question. What happens when accountability repeatedly activates shame? How does a nervous system respond when every difficult conversation begins to feel like evidence that it is fundamentally failing? These are questions I ask frequently in my therapy office because they apply not only to couples, but also to parents, teenagers, business leaders, athletes, and individuals struggling with many different forms of emotional distress. One of the encouraging aspects of psychology is that shame is not permanent. People can learn to experience accountability without experiencing total self-condemnation. That process often begins by separating identity from behavior. Healthy accountability says, I made a mistake and I am responsible for repairing it. Toxic shame says, because I made a mistake, I am beyond repair. Those are profoundly different beliefs, and they lead to profoundly different outcomes. As therapists, one of our goals is to help people develop enough emotional safety within themselves that they can tolerate hearing difficult feedback without collapsing into shame or escaping through defensiveness. We help clients learn that accepting responsibility does not diminish their worth. In fact, it often strengthens it. The ability to say, you're right, I hurt you, I understand the impact, and I want to learn how to respond differently requires tremendous emotional maturity. That kind of response does not grow from humiliation. It grows from self-awareness, emotional regulation, and the belief that mistakes are opportunities for growth rather than evidence of personal failure. This distinction becomes critically important because shame and insight are not the same thing. A person can be flooded with shame and still never change. Likewise, a person can gain tremendous insight into their behavior and still struggle to respond differently when stress activates old neural pathways. Understanding why requires us to look at another remarkable feature of the human brain. It is one thing to recognize a pattern intellectually. It is another thing entirely to teach the nervous system a different way of responding in the moment. That is exactly where we're headed next, as we explore why insight does not automatically create lasting behavioral change. One of the most common experiences I have in my therapy practice is sitting across from someone who says, I know exactly what I'm doing wrong. Sometimes they'll even tell me, I've read the books, I've listened to podcasts, I've been in therapy before, I understand why I do it, I just can't seem to stop. There is often tremendous frustration in those moments because people naturally assume that once they understand the problem, the solution should quickly follow. Unfortunately, psychology and neuroscience tell us something very different. Understanding a behavior and changing a behavior are two separate psychological processes. This is one of the reasons therapy can sometimes feel discouraging in the beginning. Clients often experience tremendous insight during their first few sessions. They begin recognizing patterns they had never noticed before. They understand how childhood experiences shaped their attachment style. They recognize how anxiety influences their communication. They begin connecting the dots between stress, emotional regulation, and repeated behaviors. That awareness is incredibly important because insight is the doorway to change. However, insight by itself does not automatically create new behavior. It simply gives us a map. We still have to walk the path. One of the reasons for this lies in the remarkable way our brains are designed. The brain is constantly trying to become more efficient. Rather than making us think through every action from the beginning each day, it develops neural pathways. Neural pathways are networks of brain cells that become more efficient the more often they are used. You can think of them as trails through a forest. The first time someone walks across an open field, there is no visible path. If they walk the exact same route every day for several years, eventually a well-worn trail develops. Future travelers naturally follow the existing trail because it requires less effort than creating a brand new one. Our emotional lives develop in exactly the same way. Every repeated response to stress strengthens a particular neural pathway. If someone has spent years responding to anxiety by drinking, avoiding difficult conversations, shutting down emotionally, becoming defensive, or working excessively, those responses gradually become familiar to the nervous system. Eventually, they begin occurring automatically, often before the person has consciously decided how they want to respond. This is not because the person lacks intelligence or motivation. It is because the brain has become exceptionally efficient at following pathways it has practiced thousands of times before. This process is connected to another important psychological concept called habit formation. A habit is not simply something we do repeatedly. A habit is a behavior that has become increasingly automatic because the brain has learned to perform it with very little conscious effort. Habits allow us to drive familiar routes, brush our teeth, tie our shoes, and type on a keyboard without carefully thinking through every movement. Most of the time, habits are incredibly helpful because they conserve mental energy. The challenge arises when unhealthy coping strategies become habitual as well. Imagine someone who has spent 20 years reaching for alcohol whenever they feel overwhelmed. The moment stress increases, their brain immediately activates the familiar pathway. That doesn't necessarily mean they've consciously decided to drink. Their nervous system has simply recognized a familiar emotional state and begun preparing the response that has historically provided relief. By the time conscious awareness catches up, the person may already find themselves pouring a drink. This helps explain why so many people describe unhealthy behaviors by saying, "I don't even know why I did it. It just happened." That statement can be incredibly frustrating for loved ones to hear because it sounds like an excuse. However, from a neuroscience perspective, it often reflects the speed at which automatic neural pathways operate. Understanding that process does not remove accountability. Rather, it tells us where accountability needs to be directed. Instead of simply telling ourselves, "I have to try harder," we begin recognizing that we must repeatedly practice a different response until the brain gradually builds a stronger pathway. This remarkable ability of the brain to reorganize itself is known as neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's lifelong capacity to create new neural connections in response to repeated experience. For many years, scientists believed the adult brain was relatively fixed after childhood. Modern neuroscience has shown us something much more hopeful. Throughout our lives, the brain continues changing based on what we repeatedly think, practice, experience, and do. Every time we choose a healthier response instead of an old automatic one, we strengthen a new pathway. Every repetition makes that healthier response slightly easier the next time. One of my favorite ways to explain neuroplasticity is to compare it to learning a musical instrument. Imagine someone decides they want to learn the piano. During the first lesson, every movement feels awkward. Their fingers move slowly. They look down constantly. They make mistakes. They have to think about every note. No one expects mastery after one lesson. We understand that becoming a pianist requires thousands of repetitions over many months or years. Yet somehow, many of us expect emotional growth to happen differently. We think that because someone sincerely apologized, they should automatically communicate differently forever. We think that because someone attended therapy twice, they should instantly regulate emotions they've struggled with for decades. We think that because someone finally understands why they behave the way they do, lasting change should immediately follow. The nervous system doesn't learn that way. It learns through repetition. It learns through practice. It learns through consistency. That is why meaningful therapy is rarely about having one powerful conversation. Instead, it involves repeatedly practicing new ways of responding until they become increasingly familiar. We help clients notice the moment before the automatic reaction occurs. We teach them to recognize early signs of stress, shame, anxiety, or emotional flooding. We introduce healthier coping strategies and then practice those strategies over and over again until the nervous system begins recognizing them as viable alternatives. Again, I want to return to our reality case study because I think it illustrates this beautifully. Many viewers watched Kyle publicly apologize on multiple occasions. Whether discussing alcohol, communication, or conflict, There appeared to be genuine moments of remorse. Rather than asking whether those apologies were sincere, psychology encourages us to ask a different question. Were the underlying neural pathways changing? Were the emotional regulation skills becoming stronger? Was the nervous system developing new ways of responding under stress? None of us can answer those questions definitively because we do not know what work was occurring privately. What we can say is that lasting behavioral change requires much more than insight or remorse. It requires repeated practice until healthier responses become increasingly automatic. One of the most hopeful messages I share with clients is that the brain is never asking for you to get it just right. It is asking for repetition. Every time someone pauses before reacting, every time they tolerate discomfort without escaping it, every time they stay present during a difficult conversation instead of becoming defensive, they are strengthening a different neural pathway. At first, those moments may feel awkward and exhausting. Over time, they become more natural. Eventually, the healthier response begins replacing the old one. That is why I often tell clients that healing is not measured by whether they never struggle again. Healing is measured by whether they recover differently than they did before. It is measured by whether they recognize the pattern sooner, regulate more effectively, repair more quickly, and continue practicing even after setbacks. Progress is rarely dramatic. More often, it is quiet, consistent, and cumulative. This brings us to another question that sits underneath nearly every repeated behavior. If people have spent years identifying themselves through work, alcohol, achievement, humor, or being the life of the party, then who are they without those roles? Changing behavior often requires changing identity, and that can be one of the most frightening psychological tasks any human being undertakes. That is exactly where we're headed next as we explore identity, self-worth, and the question many people never stop to ask themselves, who am I when I am no longer hiding behind the role I've always played? One of the most profound questions a person can ever ask themselves is not, what do I do? But rather, who am I? At first glance, those questions may seem almost identical. In reality, they are fundamentally different. One asks about performance, the other asks about identity. One asks about what we produce, accomplish, or contribute. The other asks about our sense of self that exists even when those accomplishments are temporarily taken away. In psychology, identity refers to the relatively stable understanding we have of who we are. It includes our values, beliefs, strengths, goals, relationships, and the way we see ourselves in the world. A healthy identity allows us to experience success without becoming arrogant, and disappointment without believing we are worthless. It provides a stable internal foundation that remains relatively consistent even as our circumstances change. The challenge is that many people never have the opportunity to develop an identity that is separate from the roles they perform. Instead, they gradually become known as the athlete, the successful business owner, the funny one, the caretaker, the responsible sibling, the perfectionist, or the life of the party. Over time, those roles become so familiar that they begin replacing the person's deeper understanding of themselves. The role becomes the identity. This process is especially common in high-achieving individuals. From a very young age, they may have received praise primarily for what they accomplished rather than for who they were. An athlete is celebrated for winning. A student is praised for grades. A performer receives applause for entertaining. An entrepreneur is admired for building a successful company. None of these experiences are inherently unhealthy. Achievement is wonderful, and there is nothing wrong with taking pride in hard work or success. The difficulty arises when a person's worth becomes dependent upon continuing to perform at that same level. Imagine an Olympic athlete who has spent 20 years training toward one competition. Every decision they make revolves around that goal. Their schedule, friendships, Sleep, nutrition, education, and daily routine are organized around becoming the best in the world. Then one day their career ends, whether through retirement, injury, or age. The question that often follows is not simply, what do I do now? The much deeper question is, who am I now? Their identity has been so closely connected to performance that losing the role feels like losing part of themselves. I see this transition frequently in my therapy practice, particularly with athletes and young adults. Parents often spend years helping their children excel in sports, academics, music, or other pursuits. Those experiences teach discipline, resilience, teamwork, and perseverance, all of which are incredibly valuable. However, if a young person never develops an identity beyond performance, adulthood can become surprisingly unsettling. They may achieve success and still feel empty because they have spent their lives answering the question, what am I good at? Without ever exploring the question, who am I apart from what I accomplish? The same principle applies to entrepreneurship. Building a business often requires extraordinary sacrifice. Entrepreneurs work long hours, tolerate enormous uncertainty, assume significant financial risk, and carry responsibilities that most people never see. Their business becomes something they nurture, protect, and grow. It becomes deeply personal. Over time, however, many entrepreneurs begin experiencing the success or failure of the company as evidence of their own personal value. If the company struggles, they do not simply think, the business had a difficult quarter. Instead, they begin thinking, I am failing. Again, I want to be very clear that I am not suggesting this is what Kyle experienced privately. None of us can know that. What we do know from his publicly available story is that viewers watch someone carrying the responsibilities of building a nationally recognized company while simultaneously navigating marriage, reality television, public criticism, and the expectations that come with being a founder. Whether those pressures influenced his emotional world is something only he could answer. However, the psychological principle itself is one I encounter frequently. When identity becomes fused with achievement, accountability can begin feeling like a threat to the self rather than simply feedback about behavior. This is also one reason change can feel frightening. Imagine someone whose entire social life has revolved around drinking. Their closest friendships were formed at bars, celebrations, work events, or parties. They have become known as the outgoing, entertaining person who keeps everyone laughing. If they begin changing their relationship with alcohol, they are not simply giving up a substance. They may fear losing friendships, social confidence, routines, or even the version of themselves they have always known. The question quietly becomes, if I stop doing this, who will I be? That question is rarely spoken aloud, yet it often sits beneath the surface of behavioral change. The same thing happens with work. A person whose identity revolves around being productive may feel deeply uncomfortable resting. Sitting quietly may create anxiety because productivity has become the primary source of self-worth. Slowing down is no longer simply taking a break. It feels like becoming invisible. Likewise, someone whose identity revolves around rescuing others may struggle to establish healthy boundaries because helping has become the way they experience purpose and belonging. This is why lasting behavioral change almost always requires identity development. We are not simply asking someone to stop a behavior. We are inviting them to become a different version of themselves. That is an enormous psychological task because identity develops over years, sometimes decades. It cannot be replaced overnight. In my therapy practice, I often encourage clients to become curious about the roles they have carried throughout their lives. I might ask, who taught you that you always had to be strong? Or, what happens inside you when you are no longer the person fixing everyone else's problems? Sometimes I ask athletes, who are you when you're not competing? Entrepreneurs may hear me ask, Who are you when you're not working? Parents may be asked, who are you beyond being someone's mother or father? These questions are not designed to create uncertainty. They are designed to help people discover an identity that is broader, more stable, and less dependent upon external performance. One of the beautiful aspects of this work is that it creates freedom. When identity becomes rooted in values rather than roles, life becomes far more flexible. A person can lose a job and still know who they are. They can retire from sports and still experience purpose. They can make a mistake without believing they are a mistake. They can receive criticism without feeling that their entire identity is collapsing. Their nervous system becomes less dependent on external validation because their sense of self has developed from the inside out. This idea connects beautifully with Bowen family systems theory and the concept of differentiation of self, which we've discussed in earlier episodes. Differentiation refers to the ability to maintain a clear sense of who you are while remaining emotionally connected to the important people in your life. Highly differentiated individuals do not lose themselves inside relationships, careers, or family roles. They can tolerate disagreement without abandoning their values. They can receive feedback without becoming emotionally overwhelmed. They understand that their worth as a human being is not determined solely by success, failure, praise, or criticism. Ultimately, identity is not something we discover once and never revisit. It continues evolving throughout our lives. Every transition, every relationship, every success, every disappointment, and every season of growth invites us to ask again, who am I becoming? The healthiest identities are not built upon perfection. They are built upon values, integrity, curiosity, humility, and the willingness to keep growing. As we move toward the final chapters of today's episode, one important question remains. If people genuinely want to change, and if they begin understanding the emotional roots of their behavior, why do some people embrace change while others resist it? Psychology has spent decades studying this question, and the answer lies in a fascinating framework known as the stages of change model. Understanding where someone is in the change process may completely transform the way we think about motivation, readiness, and lasting behavioral growth. That is exactly where we're headed next. One of the most common frustrations I hear from parents, spouses, and even clients themselves is the belief that if someone truly wanted to change, they simply would. On the surface, that assumption seems logical. After all, if a behavior is damaging a marriage, hurting children, threatening a career, or affecting someone's health, why wouldn't they immediately stop? Why would anyone knowingly continue doing something that causes so much pain? As we come to the final section of today's episode, I want to leave you with the most hopeful concept of all. If the brain can change, if identities can evolve, and if relationships can develop healthier patterns over time, then what does real hope actually look like? Not wishful thinking, not empty promises, but hope grounded in psychology, neuroscience, accountability, and the remarkable capacity of human beings to grow. That is exactly where we'll finish today's conversation. One of the most common frustrations I hear from parents, spouses, and even clients themselves is the belief that if someone truly wanted to change, they simply would. On the surface, that assumption seems logical. After all, if a behavior is damaging a marriage, hurting children, threatening a career, or affecting someone's health, why wouldn't they immediately stop? Why would anyone knowingly continue doing something that causes so much pain? Over the years, both research and my own experience in the therapy room have taught me that motivation is much more complicated than that. Human beings are often deeply ambivalent about change. Ambivalence is a psychological term that refers to having two opposing feelings or desires at the same time. A person may genuinely want a healthier marriage while simultaneously feeling terrified of giving up the coping strategy that has helped them manage stress for years. They may sincerely want sobriety while also fearing life without alcohol. They may desperately want a closer relationship with their children while still lacking the emotional regulation skills necessary to respond differently during moments of conflict. One of the most helpful frameworks I use in my therapy practice to understand this process is called the Stages of Change model, developed by psychologists James Prochaska and Carlo Di Clemente. Originally developed while studying addiction and behavioral change, this model has since become one of the most widely used approaches in psychology because it applies to nearly every area of life. Whether someone is trying to improve communication, reduce alcohol use, strengthen their marriage, manage anxiety, exercise more consistently, or develop healthier emotional regulation skills, lasting change rarely happens all at once. Instead, people tend to move through a series of predictable psychological stages. The first stage is called pre-contemplation. During this stage, the individual does not yet fully recognize that their behavior is creating a significant problem, or they may believe the problem exists, but feel that someone else is primarily responsible for it. From the outside, this can appear frustrating because family members often feel as though they are talking to someone who simply refuses to listen. In reality, the person's nervous system may still be protecting them from fully acknowledging the impact of their behavior. They may minimize, rationalize, compare themselves to others, or convince themselves that things are not that bad. These responses are not necessarily evidence that they do not care. Often they reflect psychological protection from overwhelming shame or fear. The second stage is known as contemplation. This is where something begins shifting internally. The individual starts recognizing that there may indeed be a problem. However, recognition does not immediately produce action. Instead, they become caught between two competing truths. One part of them wants change, while another part wants things to remain exactly as they are because familiar coping strategies still provide comfort or relief. This internal conflict is what psychologists call ambivalence. It is one of the most emotionally exhausting stages because the person can clearly see both the benefits and the costs of change. They are no longer denying the problem, but they have not yet committed to doing something different. I often explain contemplation to clients by asking them to imagine standing with one foot on the dock and one foot in a boat that is slowly drifting away. They know they cannot remain in that position forever, yet deciding which direction to move feels incredibly difficult. Every choice involves both gains and losses. This is why people may spend months or even years in contemplation. They are not necessarily being stubborn. They are wrestling with uncertainty, fear, grief, identity, and the loss of familiar ways of coping. The third stage is called preparation. During this stage, the person has made an internal decision that change is necessary and begins planning how to move forward. They may begin reading books, listening to podcasts, attending therapy, joining a support group, researching treatment options, or having honest conversations with trusted people. Preparation is important because lasting change rarely occurs without intentional planning. Motivation alone tends to fade. Systems, structure, accountability, and support help bridge the gap between intention and behavior. The fourth stage is action, and this is the stage most people mistakenly believe is the entire process. Action refers to the period when observable behavioral changes begin occurring. The individual may stop drinking, begin therapy consistently, practice emotional regulation skills, establish healthier boundaries, apologize more effectively, or develop new routines. While this stage is highly visible, it is also emotionally demanding. The old coping strategies are no longer available, and the new ones still feel unfamiliar. The nervous system has not yet fully rewired itself, so each healthier choice requires significant conscious effort. This is one reason early recovery or early behavioral change can feel surprisingly exhausting People often assume that once they begin doing the right thing, life should immediately become easier. In reality, the opposite is often true for a period of time. The brain continues craving familiar pathways while simultaneously trying to strengthen healthier ones. That internal tug of war requires patience, repetition, and tremendous compassion. The fifth stage is maintenance. This stage is not simply about avoiding old behaviors. It is about building a new identity and a new way of living. By this point, the healthier behaviors have been practiced repeatedly enough that they begin feeling more natural. The person continues strengthening emotional regulation, communication, accountability, and healthier coping strategies. They are no longer relying solely on willpower because many of the new neural pathways have become stronger through repetition. Maintenance reminds us that recovery is not an event. It is an ongoing process of reinforcing the life we are trying to build. Finally, there is a stage that many people misunderstand: relapse. In psychology, relapse is not viewed as evidence that treatment has failed or that a person is incapable of change. Rather, relapse is often viewed as information. It tells us that something overwhelmed the person's current coping abilities. That does not excuse harmful behavior or eliminate accountability, but it does provide valuable insight. What stressors were present? What emotional needs were not being addressed? What warning signs were missed? What supports need strengthening? When approached thoughtfully, relapse can become part of the learning process rather than the end of it. This framework has profoundly influenced the way I work with clients because it reminds us that people cannot be rushed through stages they have not yet completed. As much as we wish we could motivate someone into action, lasting change is ultimately an internal process. We can encourage, educate, support, establish boundaries, and hold people accountable. But we cannot do their psychological work for them. In fact, one of the greatest acts of love is allowing another person to take ownership of their own change rather than carrying it for them. As I watched Amanda and Kyle's publicly shared journey over many years, I often found myself wondering where each of them might have been within this model at different points in time. Again, I want to emphasize that this is not a diagnosis or an attempt to assign stages to either individual. Only they know their internal experiences. However, their public story provides an excellent opportunity to understand that behavioral change is rarely linear. There are often moments of insight, periods of progress, setbacks, renewed motivation, discouragement, and growth. This is true not only for reality television personalities, but for nearly every client who has ever sat across from me. Perhaps the most hopeful message within the stages of change model is that people are capable of moving forward. They are not permanently defined by where they are today. Someone who is currently contemplating change is not destined to remain there forever. Someone who experiences a relapse has not erased every lesson they have learned. Growth is rarely a straight line. More often, it resembles a winding path filled with pauses, detours, setbacks, and renewed commitment. As we come to the final section of today's episode, I want to leave you with the most hopeful concept of all. If the brain can change, if identities can evolve, and if relationships can develop healthier patterns over time, then what does real hope actually look like? Not wishful thinking, not empty promises, but hope grounded in psychology, neuroscience, accountability, and the remarkable capacity of human beings to grow. Section 8. Can someone change if they don't understand why they do what they do? After everything we've discussed today, I hope your answer is becoming clearer. The answer is probably not. Not because people are incapable of change, not because they don't care, not because they're weak, but because meaningful change requires awareness before it requires action. If someone believes alcohol is the problem, but alcohol has actually become their solution to chronic stress, shame, loneliness, or emotional pain, then removing the alcohol without addressing the underlying emotional needs often leaves the nervous system searching for another escape. The behavior may change temporarily, but the emotional struggle remains unresolved. Eventually, the brain begins looking for another way to reduce discomfort, and the cycle often repeats itself. This is one of the reasons lasting behavioral change is rarely about willpower alone. For many years, society has promoted the idea that if people simply wanted something badly enough, they would change. While motivation certainly matters, psychology has shown us that motivation is only one part of the equation. Sustainable change requires awareness, emotional regulation, repeated practice, accountability, supportive relationships, and a nervous system that gradually learns there are healthier ways to respond to stress than the ones it has relied upon for years. One of the most encouraging discoveries in modern psychology is that human beings are remarkably adaptable. Earlier in today's episode, we discussed neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural pathways throughout life. That means your brain is not fixed. Your emotional responses are not permanently set in stone. The coping strategies you learned at 16, 26, or 36 do not have to remain the strategies you rely upon for the rest of your life. This is a distinction that I think surprises many people. We often have moments of tremendous insight. We read a book that changes our perspective. We listen to a podcast that helps us finally understand our childhood. We attend therapy and suddenly recognize a pattern we've repeated for decades. Those moments are incredibly valuable because insight creates awareness. But awareness alone does not create a new neural pathway. The nervous system changes when insight is followed by repeated action. Imagine someone who decides they want to become physically stronger. They could read every book ever written about exercise. They could watch hundreds of instructional videos. They could hire the world's best trainer and understand every muscle group in the human body. None of that information, by itself, would make them physically stronger. Strength develops through consistent practice over time. Emotional growth follows a remarkably similar process. We strengthen emotional regulation by repeatedly practicing emotional regulation. We strengthen accountability by repeatedly practicing accountability. We strengthen honesty by repeatedly choosing honesty, especially when it feels uncomfortable. This is why I often tell clients that healing is less about dramatic transformation and more about ordinary repetition. Lasting change usually happens quietly. It happens every time someone pauses before reacting instead of speaking impulsively. It happens every time they tolerate uncomfortable emotions without immediately escaping them. It happens every time they choose curiosity instead of defensiveness, accountability instead of blame, or repair instead of avoidance. These moments may seem insignificant on their own, but over weeks, months, and years, they begin reshaping both the brain and the relationships around them. One of the concepts we've returned to throughout this reality case studies series is Bowen family systems theory, particularly the idea that relationships function as emotional systems. One of Bowen's greatest contributions to psychology was helping us understand that when one person changes, the entire system is affected. Healthy change is rarely an individual event. It influences partners, children, parents, siblings, friendships, and sometimes even future generations. This is one of the reasons I am so passionate about the work I do. Every week in my therapy practice, I have the privilege of watching people interrupt patterns that have existed in their families for decades. I work with parents who are determined to respond differently than their own parents did. I work with couples who are learning to communicate without criticism or defensiveness. I work with young adults who are discovering that ADHD does not define them, that anxiety can be managed, and that executive functioning skills can be strengthened. I work with athletes learning that their value extends far beyond performance. I work with individuals recovering from addiction who are building entirely new ways of regulating their nervous systems. None of those transformations happen overnight. As I watched Amanda and Kyle's publicly shared relationship over many years, I wasn't most interested in who won the argument or who was right. I found myself becoming curious about something much deeper. I wondered what each person's nervous system had learned about love, conflict, responsibility, shame, emotional safety, and connection long before they ever met one another. I wondered how those lessons shaped the way they responded under stress. Again, I cannot know their private experiences, and I am not offering conclusions about their relationship. What I am saying is that their public story gives us an opportunity to ask questions that apply to all of us. What have our nervous systems learned? What coping strategies have we been practicing? What identities have we built around performance, productivity, achievement, or pleasing others? What patterns are quietly shaping our own relationships without us even realizing it? Those questions matter because meaningful change begins long before behavior changes. It begins with the courage to become curious about ourselves. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson psychology has to offer. People do not stay static. We are constantly learning, constantly adapting, constantly growing. Our brains remain capable of forming new neural pathways. Our relationships remain capable of developing healthier emotional patterns. Our identities continue evolving throughout life, and our families can change, one person at a time. That does not mean change is easy. It does not mean everyone chooses it. It does not mean relationships always survive the process. But it does mean that growth remains possible, as long as we are willing to become students of ourselves, as long as we remain curious, as long as we continue practicing, as long as we remember that lasting change is not measured by perfection, but by persistence. If today's conversation has taught us anything, I hope it is this. One of the reasons I created the Path to Peace Pause is because my hope has never been for you to simply become more knowledgeable about psychology. Knowledge is valuable, but insight only becomes meaningful when we begin applying it to ourselves. Throughout this Reality Case Studies trademark series, we've used Amanda and Kyle's publicly shared relationship as a way of exploring larger psychological principles that influence every family, every marriage, every friendship, and every human being. If today's episode resonated with you and you'd like to go deeper, I'd love to invite you inside the Path to Peace Therapy Companion Journal on Patreon. That is where we continue the work with additional reflection questions, guided journaling prompts, Bowen Family Systems exercises, clinical explanations, and practical tools to help you apply today's concepts to your own life. The link to join will be in today's show notes. So let's pause together. Take a slow, deep breath and spend a few moments reflecting on your own life. If today's episode accomplished anything, I hope it reminded you that behavior rarely tells the entire story. Human beings are incredibly complex. Behind nearly every repeated behavior is a nervous system trying to solve a problem, reduce emotional pain, or protect itself in the only way it has learned. That understanding does not excuse harmful behavior, nor does it eliminate accountability. What it does is invite compassion into the conversation. And compassion, when combined with accountability, creates an environment where lasting growth becomes possible. As you move through the rest of your week, I'd like to invite you to become less interested in judging behavior and more interested in understanding it. That includes the behavior of your spouse, your children, your parents, your friends, your coworkers, and perhaps most importantly, yourself. Every time you notice yourself reacting automatically, becoming defensive, withdrawing, or reaching for a familiar coping strategy, simply pause and ask yourself, what might my nervous system be trying to protect me from right now? You don't have to solve the answer immediately. Simply asking the question begins creating awareness, and awareness is where meaningful change always begins. Remember, healing is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming increasingly aware of the patterns that have quietly shaped your life and then choosing one small decision at a time to respond differently. The brain changes through repetition, relationships change through consistency, and families change when even one person begins responding with greater self-awareness and emotional regulation. Reflection. Question 1. The first question I'd like to leave you with today is this. What behavior, either in yourself or in someone you love, have you been judging without first becoming curious about what emotional need that behavior might be trying to meet? As you've listened to today's episode, perhaps someone came to mind. Maybe it's your spouse. Maybe it's your teenager. Maybe it's your adult child. Maybe it's a close friend. Or perhaps, if you're honest with yourself, the person you've been judging most harshly is you. Rather than asking, why do I keep doing this? Try asking a different question. What emotional problem has my nervous system been trying to solve? That one question has the power to completely change the way you understand yourself. Reflection. Question 2. My second question is one I often ask clients in my therapy office because I believe it gets to the heart of lasting transformation. If the coping strategy you've relied upon for years suddenly disappeared tomorrow, who would you be without it? If work were no longer your identity, if alcohol were no longer your escape, if perfectionism were no longer your protection, if constantly taking care of everyone else were no longer your purpose, who would you become? That question isn't meant to create fear, it's meant to create possibility. Because sometimes the life we're trying to build cannot fully emerge until we're willing to let go of the identity we've been holding on to for years. If today's conversation resonated with you, I'd love to invite you to continue this work inside the Path to Peace Therapy Companion Journal on Patreon. In this week's Companion Journal, we'll go much deeper into today's psychological concepts through guided therapeutic exercises, clinical reflections, and journaling prompts designed to help you apply these ideas to your own life. Together, we'll explore the emotional function of your own coping strategies. Identify the roles you've carried throughout your life, examine how your identity has been shaped by your family system, and use evidence-informed psychology to begin building healthier patterns moving forward. We'll also explore the stages of change model in greater depth, complete an identity inventory, map your current coping strategies, and develop one practical action step you can begin practicing this week. The public podcast introduces the psychology. The Companion Journal is where the personal work begins. You'll find the link to the Path to Peace Therapy Community on Patreon in today's show notes. In our next episode, we'll explore one of the most difficult questions in any relationship. Can trust ever truly be rebuilt after it has been broken? We'll examine the psychology of betrayal, forgiveness, emotional safety, and why rebuilding trust requires far more than an apology. Together, we'll discuss what genuine repair looks like, why consistency matters more than promises, and how trust is slowly restored, or permanently lost, through everyday choices. Using Amanda Batula and Kyle Cooke's publicly available relationship as our educational case study, we'll continue exploring the psychological principles that help us better understand ourselves, our relationships, and the path toward lasting emotional healing. Reality Case Studies, Season 1, Amanda Batula and Kyle Cooke. Episode 4, Can Trust Ever Be Rebuilt? Betrayal, Forgiveness, and the Psychology of Repair. I hope you'll join me. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. Whether you're a longtime listener, a parent searching for answers, someone navigating your own healing journey, or simply someone who enjoys understanding the psychology behind human behavior, I want you to know how grateful I am that you've chosen to spend part of your day here. Reality Case Studies is an educational series that uses publicly available stories to teach evidence-informed psychology, helping listeners better understand themselves, their relationships, and the emotional patterns that shape everyday life. As both a therapist and a family systems coach, I have the privilege of watching people change every single week. I've seen marriages heal. I've seen parents reconnect with their children. I've watched young adults discover confidence they never believed they possessed. I've watched individuals break generational patterns that had existed for decades. Those experiences remind me that people are capable of extraordinary growth, because when they become willing to understand themselves with honesty, curiosity, courage, and compassion. As always, remember this: you cannot change what you do not understand. But once you begin understanding your nervous system, your emotional patterns, and your family system, you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin asking, "What happened to me? And what healthier pattern can I begin practicing today?" That single shift has the power to change relationships, families, and sometimes entire generations. I'm Stephanie Buckley, an AMFT, ADHD, and OCD specialist, family systems coach, and creator of reality case studies. Thank you for listening to the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. Until next time, take good care of yourself. Until next time.